So recently I've been trying to compile a list of melodic embellishments and devices. I'm calling this list the Bebop rudiments. So I'm gonna play some of them, explain what they are, and how they connect together to create lines and bebop language. Now all of this of course is just going to be the way that I understand these things and the terms that I've given them based on the way that I've come to understand them, where I've learned them, or who I've seen teach them. A lot of these bebop devices I haven't seen explicitly talked about before, so I thought it would be useful to come up with some terminology and explanations to better communicate to people and help others learn. So let's take a look. Starting with the simple and then moving on to the more complex and compound. For a lot of our examples, I'm going to be demonstrating on the first note of the tune Just Friends. The first one is falls, and that sounds like this. Just falling onto the note. So whatever note you're meaning to embellish, you're just falling onto that from a scale tone above. So let's take the first note of Just Friends. That note, that B. So we can fall onto that note instead of just playing it right away. Okay, just falling onto it. Simple as that. The next move is sort of a variation of the fall, and that's basically where whatever note you're hitting, you hit it first and then do a fall. Okay, so I call that a flutter. And so on, right? Next are approaches. Most of us know what approaches are. It's just hitting a given note from a chromatic under. So you play a half step under, and then you hit the note you are emphasizing or embellishing. In this case, that B. You can do them up a scale or down the scale. Next is the same sort of thing as a flutter, where you hit the note and then you do an approach. So I call that a juke. With our example note. Next one is runs. And we can do 3-note runs, 5-note runs, or 7-note runs, or however many you want, but those are common ones that you'll hear. Let's take a listen to what they sound like. And down, going down. Now let's look at 5-note runs. Just going up 5 notes of a scale. For example, sometimes I hear this lick. That's something you might hear. Like at the end of a solo maybe. Or a 7-note run. Barry Harris will often say, when you run a scale, you only run it up to the 7th. And then maybe you come back down. So you could do that off of every note. And you could also run down and go back up. So with our Just Friends example, let's do a 7-note run up to that B, and let's do a 7-note run down to a B. Or we could run down. So those are runs. The next one is skips. If we take a scale, we can play it all with skips. Doing a skip on every note, we could come down. And that's just one single skip, a dyad skip, but we could also do triads. And we could come down. and so on. And you could also do quadrat. So those are arpeggios, right? So those are skips and arpeggios. Now with arpeggios, you could also go up one and come down the next. You could do a lot of different patterns just with skips and arpeggios. But that one right there, that sort of zigzag pattern, I call that clasping, because it's kind of like you're taking the notes of one and taking the notes of the other and putting them in between. Sort of, yeah, it reminds me of clasping your fingers together. Getting these the notes of the chord sort of interlocking like that. The next one is just a chromatic passing tone, and that's real simple. Anywhere that there are two notes, you put a half step in between them. So like in the major scale, between the first two notes, you could put a half step. Between 2 and 3, or should I say re and mi, you could put a half step. Between fa and so, that is chromatic passing tones. Anywhere that there's two notes a whole step apart, you can put a chromatic passing tone between them. Now we can start talking about how some of the simpler rudiments combine to get the more complex rudiments that we know and are kind of familiar with. One example are turns. That sounds like this. And you could also do them down, where you start with the approach first. When we are approaching from under first, I call them oofs, because we go under, we approach from under, and then we fall onto, so UF, oof. And then when we're doing it the other way, like that, I call them foos, because it's the opposite. You fall onto the note, and then you approach from under. That's an oof, but we could also do a foo. Now a lot of people call these enclosures. I do not call them enclosures, because I view enclosures as something else, which we'll talk about next. So enclosures are using those same set of notes where it's a half step below and a scale tone above, but we are not playing the target note until the end. Like that. We're going around it before we hit it. When we go from above the note first, I call that a hook. And when we go from below the note first and then fall onto it, I call those tosses. It's kind of like from under, you're tossing the note and then it falling on. Or we could do a toss instead. I kind of think in this case the hook sounds better. The next few are going to be a combination of skips or arpeggios combined with those either side notes, approaches or falls. So I'll try to go through them quickly. Approach and a skip, or falling, and so on. Here's a juke skip. Flutter skips, which is, and so on. Then we have send-offs, which is approaching the bottom note of an arpeggio. Or you can do quadrat arpeggio. That's a very common sound. You hear that all the time. And then we have a snatch, which is approaching the top note of an arpeggio and coming down. And you can do it with quadrats or triads. Let's do a quadrat. So that'll be, if we want to hit that B, we're going to have to approach the top note of a B half diminished and come down. Next is an arp fall, going up an arpeggio and falling. So we could say, there's lots of ways you can mix this up. You could do a send off and then fall. And also with falls, you get pivots, which is basically a quadrat arpeggio, except everything after the first note, you put an octave below. Instead of this, you have that. Next is a bebop scale, and bebop scales are created by the notes of the major scale, so you can think about it as a run with a chromatic passing tone inserted in there somewhere. So we can get something that sounds like that. Let's do a 7-note run up to that B on Just Friends. So if we're gonna go 7 notes, we gotta start on, or we could go down to it. Yeah, bebop scales, you could practice. And there are lots of different bebop scales that you can create and lots of different ways you can practice them. Another combination of running the major scale, inserting chromatic passing tones, and even doing some skips and stuff is Barry's chromatic scale. And I'm not going to over-explain this, I'm just going to play it for you. So that's what it sounds like going up, and here's what it sounds like going down. Or we could even say, doing more notes. Or we could go up to it. Or, again, even more notes. You can do. Next one is Pasquale's Chromatic. That is putting chromatics in the major scale, but where Barry's is more for 8th notes and 16th notes, Pasquale's is more for triplets. And so on, right? And you can do multiple in a row. You can do like that, or you can do up, triplet, triplet, boom. We could also do inchworms, which is basically, it's similar, reminds me of Pasquale's thing, but it's also adding another approach. And the key with this one is it's always a minor third space. And then the other way, it's just doing a fall instead of an approach at the end. The next one is a lob, and that's basically doing a run and skipping up like this. 3-note run and skip. We could also do 5 notes. That's a common one we hear all the time on a minor, like this. And after that we have a layup, which is basically a lob, plus a fall. Kind of like you run it up to the basket, toss it up, and then it just falls in. Or we could even do 3 notes. And then next is alley-oop, which is basically a lob. But from there, we're gonna do a hook enclosure. Next on our list, we have a Criss Cross, and that's basically where whatever note you're emphasizing, you approach the scale note below it. So like, let's say I want to emphasize this B flat. I'm going to approach the A below it, and then I'm going to fall onto the B flat. Okay, so from that approach, I'm doing a toss and falling on to that B flat. Or vice versa. If I want to approach the A, then I fall onto the scale note above it, which is this B. I'm thinking I'm in the key of F. Okay, so falling onto the B flat, and then I approach. So fall on to the note above the note you're targeting, and then you do a hook enclosure. Kind of sounds like something Pasquale would do. And then you could even flutter one of those notes, like. And next is cross stitching, which is basically just crisscrossing 2 notes that are not next to each other in the scale. So in our previous example, we were crisscrossing 3 and 4. Cross stitching would be doing 2 notes that are not next to each other. So as an example, so that's cross stitching. And next is a top slide notch, which is kind of similar to a snatch. And if you remember a snatch, that's where we go down in an arpeggio, like a quadret arpeggio, right? But we approach the top note. But a notch chord doesn't include major 7s, chords with half steps in the chord tones. So instead of doing like C major 7, for example, we would do C6. Here's an inversion where we have the root on the top, right? But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what inversion we're doing. A top slide is where you approach the top note of whatever inversion you're in. And that's the classic one where you approach the 3rd and then come down. Then we have a notch and shelf slide, which is same sort of thing, but you come down a notch, and then the 2nd note from the top of your arpeggio is the one that you're approaching. In the case of this C6, that's what it sounds like. If we crisscross and then do a notch shelf slide, then we'll get something that sounds very much like Pasquale. Next we have a slingshot, which is you start with your target note, the note you're emphasizing, you fall off of it, you skip down, and then you go right back to that note that you started on. You could do that up a whole scale, and so on. An example that you might recognize is the end of Donnelly. That little motion right there is what I'm referring to as a slingshot. Now that I think about it, Donnelly is a great tune to just play through, look at, and be like, where can I find all these devices within this tune? I'm sure almost all of Donnelly, if not the whole head, can be described using these devices. The next one is a swipe, which is basically, you're falling onto a note, but you're injecting a run. So instead of just falling onto the note, you run up to the note you're falling on from below it. Like, So that right there, that's a swipe. That's a swipe. 3, 4. So in there was a lot of swipes. Try to use them all over the chorus. Last one I'll be talking about today is you're combining a chromatic passing tone with a stationary note, and I'm gonna call this a crank. So here's an example. So something like that. I'm continuously hitting this note, but I'm letting that note fall chromatically. Another example is, or something Hank Mobley would do a lot. That phrase. You can crank up or you can crank down. Anyway, those are all the bebop rudiments I have so far. If you can think of any others, or you can think of some better names, let me know. I'd be happy to hear them.